Halo 4 Forward Unto Dawn is a 2012 live-action miniseries, which acted as a tie-in of sorts to the, at the time, upcoming game, Halo 4. The series follows a young Thomas Lasky, a new character who was set to play a major role in Halo 4, and chronicles his time as a cadet at the Corbulo Naval Academy. It's a fun little coming-of-age story set during kind of a time of uncertainty, brought upon by ongoing insurrectionary conflicts in the UNSC's outer colony worlds, when suddenly unprovoked attacks from a collection of alien races known as the Covenant present an existential threat that kind of kicks mankind's survival instincts into high gear. A lot of Halo fans, including myself, would, say that the story is very much in keeping with a lot of the themes and ideas that Halo likes to explore in the games and novels, but it's just kind of repackaged in a different way through the medium of television. That being said, would you consider Halo 4 Forward Unto Dawn a TV adaptation of Halo? I mean, it's not adapting any particular story from the games or books. No Halo video game or novel tells the story of Lasky's time at Corbulo Military Academy. In fact, Lasky didn't even exist before this show. It's his first appearance. Sure, Master Chief and Blue Team make appearances, and they're characters that originate from the games and books, but it's telling its own story that is complementary to the rest of the canon of Halo across all mediums. It's just another story that happens to take place in the same world as those games and books. And since we're talking about Halo, what about Nightfall? Nightfall is not an adaptation of any pre-existing Halo story. Or what about other franchises that span across different mediums, like the animated Resident Evil movies like Degeneration and Vendetta, or Star Wars or Star Trek, or the MCU or the DCU? This is just something that's just kind of been eating at me for years, this tendency to call things adaptations when they aren't, even by the most lenient of definitions. A composition rewritten into a new form. A composition, meaning the totality of a completed work, the narrative, the characters, situations, rewritten to conform to a different form or medium. And I feel like when it comes to video game franchises, people have been kind of conditioned to call any piece of media in the canon of any given franchise that's not a video game an adaptation, even when it clearly isn't. And I genuinely think this conditioning has come about because video game adaptations have such a strange track record when it comes to the fidelity to the source material. So any movie or show that in any way is related to a video game can just be called an adaptation, which is strange whenever you think about other franchises that aren't predominantly video game franchises, like Star Wars. Star Wars is a film series, but a television show set in the Star Wars galaxy is not called a television adaptation of Star Wars. Shows like The Clone Wars or Andor or The Mandalorian aren't labeled as TV adaptations of Star Wars. These shows are just Star Wars stories with their own characters and ideas that are just made for television. Just like how Forward Unto Dawn is very much a Halo story that has its own characters and ideas made for television. These things have their own ideas and understandings of what a Star Wars story or a Halo story should be, but they express them in wholly unique ways. They tell their own stories, not trying to adapt any pre-existing narrative from any given piece of source material. And there's one show in particular that shares a name and a mythos with a video game franchise that tells its own story on its own terms and perfectly encapsulates everything that makes that franchise what it is, fitting seamlessly into the existing canon, while also just being an amazing television show on its own merits, like standing among modern greats as like a masterclass in television. And that show is roll the thing.
Well, I do this shit for the love of the game.
I've been trying to think of an interesting way to talk about this show, because in my opinion, Amazon's Fallout is the second best piece of Fallout media, and it's a very close second with New Vegas, because they both embody so much of what makes Fallout so compelling, from an aesthetic standpoint, a presentational standpoint, thematically, and especially from a political standpoint. Being uniquely positioned as a role-playing game and taking place in such a politically volatile setting, such as Fallout's post-apocalyptic frontier, these games played such a pivotal role in shaping my understanding of the way the world works. It is just such a rich setting for exploring the worst of what humanity has to offer, and the many, many, many ways that an individual can exercise their freedom to interact with that, but also at the same time just not take itself too seriously, as a way to help us distance ourselves and abstract these concepts and these ideologies and these archetypes so that we can kind of unpack and understand where we fall on the spectrums of morality and ethics or politics. Fallout has helped me understand some very real things. Among the laundry list of things that Fallout explores and has helped people like myself understand better are things like power dynamics and historical materialism and dialectical analysis, even economic disparity under capitalism, labor exploitation, dehumanization and race relations, even class conflict, and, you know, above all else, really, how cringe Randian objectivism and laissez-faire capitalism is. Because, I mean, you know, entirely basing your understanding of morality and ethics and economics on fictional works without taking into consideration actual material conditions in the real world is pretty bad. Oh yeah, and fascism, the ideology of insecure losers, like this guy. A pathetic little man who read Hegel one time and thinks that it makes him the smartest person in the room, even though he doesn't really understand how dialectics work.
That's not how fucking dialectics works, you stupid cuck! As he would know that Hegel has never fucking ever used the terms thesis, antithesis, synthesis to start perpetuating these lies at every single fucking opportunity!
And so much of the conversation surrounding the show being framed around the idea of it being an adaptation has never really sat right with me, you know, as opposed to just a Fallout TV show. It just kind of does what the games do and takes the ideas, concepts, and themes that are at the core of the brand and uses them to form an entirely new composition. Another piece of Fallout canon, which is how it actually presents itself. But I feel like before we can actually analyze how the show does it, there's some groundwork that we need to do first. Unpack what adaptation means and what an adaptation is, and the different types of adaptation. Consider this a primer for a much more focused discussion on the first season of the show and its relationship to the rest of Fallout canon ahead of the second season coming at the end of this year. My goal here is to just explain my thought process and give you guys the tools and the ammunition that you need to draw your own conclusions and engage in the discussion. I want to get you thinking, maybe engage in the dialectic, you know, partake in some imminent critique as a treat. Adaptation is just kind of a very tricky science, like especially whenever we're talking about adapting a work that firmly exists in an active medium like video games and translating it into a passive medium like film or television. But you don't need me to tell you that. We have more than enough examples of what it looks like when filmmakers don't quite get the source material. As much of a guilty pleasure as the 1993 Super Mario Bros. Movie is for me, no one will ever be able to convince me that it fully understands Super Mario Brothers. It's just some weird thing with some recognizable proper nouns. And what's interesting is the fact that by 1993, I feel like Super Mario Brothers had a pretty well-established tone and world that it exists in. It was colorful and lighthearted and had this really unique aesthetic with like the mushrooms and the dinosaurs and the medieval castles and the wooden flying battleships. The whole like regal light fantasy with all of the different kingdoms. But it's like Annabelle and Rocky over here just kind of looked at that, and either because they didn't care or didn't know, they just kind of turned it into this weird sci-fi industrial nightmare with a little bit of Jurassic Park thrown in for good measure because it was 1993. Like, I could very easily see something like this happening during the infancy of video games, at a time when, you know, the medium wasn't as developed artistically. Like, you know, look at Pitfall or Pong. Like, how would you adapt this? Exactly. But there was a point somewhere in the late 80s and early 90s where attitudes kind of shifted in the games industry, where narratives became more important. The technology had gotten to a point where developers were more free to explore other aspects of their creativity that wasn't purely the mechanical or technical side of making a video game. Video games could be literature with narratives and characters, themes, and yes, politics. You got to keep that in mind. It'll always come back around. Nothing is apolitical. You can't escape it. You are in the wheel of samsara. You cannot escape. Metal Gear, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy VII, Soul Reaver, Fallout. Hell, even games with less complex narratives like Tomb Raider or Zelda were being injected with more personality and style than early games like Adventure on the Atari 2600. There was a huge shift in quality of storytelling and style that game devs could engage in. Now, does this mean that video games, like books and comic books before them, were ready to make that jump and have their stories and characters shared across mediums? Well, kinda. But the problem was, and still is in many cases, that filmmakers, screenwriters, and producers, especially producers, just weren't very literate when it came to the games and their stories. But when a producer in Hollywood sees an IP getting pretty big, they'll swoop in and buy up the film rights, strike a deal, whatever, and instead of taking the time to understand what they have and getting the right people for the job, they just get someone to do something, but make sure that you include some recognizable proper nouns. Like, in a lot of cases, not even recognizable concepts, just literally the name of a thing. Like, look at the Goombas in the Mario movie. What is this? That's not a Goomba. They made Yoshi a Velociraptor. Oh, and hey, yeah, we jump forward in time a little bit, and it's the early 2000s, and everyone is doing a lot of like wire work and slow motion, so if you can, just throw a little bit of that in there for good measure, you know, because it's making the money. Everyone loves the Matrix. Chasing trends is just a major problem when talking about adaptations in general. Even in a world where we can have HBO's The Last of Us or Netflix Castlevania, Arcane, we still have like the Uncharted movie, or Paramount's Halo series. Things that are made with the idea of banking on name recognition and chasing trends instead of a love for the source material. Why would we need to come up with something unique whenever we have the name? Like, come on, we got the Tomb Raider name. We already signed Angelina Jolie on to be Lara Croft. You know, what else is popular right now? The Matrix? Okay, so let's do some bullet time and wire work, slow-mo, whatever. But just do it and throw in the whole treasure hunting gimmick and profit. You know, on a side note, I actually did know someone growing up who did not know that Tomb Raider and Underworld were two different movies. So, you know, do with that what you will. Or, you know, to be a little bit more contemporary, I a Paramount Viacom executive see no point in searching for people who understand this silly little Halo thing that we have. I don't care about reaching out to any of the original creators. They're beneath me. I just want to bank on name recognition. I just want my Game of Thrones, you know? We need our Game of Thrones. I mean, come on, the main dude's name is already Jon. We just need a space Targaryen. All right, I'm being a little facetious, but you see what I mean, I hope. In a world where a lot of these things are committee-driven, people don't feel it necessary to actually understand the thing that they're adapting. They just see an intellectual property with a built-in audience and an opportunity to maximize their success by throwing in elements of other things that they see are doing well. You know, movies like Lara Croft Tomb Raider, or Warcraft, or the many attempts at Doom, Mortal Kombat 2021, or Paramount's Halo series are some of the most vapid attempts at adaptation, be they video games or otherwise. Vapid in the sense that there is nothing tying these movies or shows back to their original works, or at least nothing beyond the surface level. And as I've said, that usually just means nothing more than just some recognizable proper nouns that refer to things that might not even be recognizable. But if you're gonna do it properly, these things are a very delicate balance on a beam suspended above two pools of really shallow water. On one side, you have what I just described, the vapid trend chasing with the recognizable proper nouns. But on the other side, you have what I like to call the Watchmen phenomenon, where no matter how faithful you're trying to be, adapting something that is so entrenched in the trappings of one particular medium into another verbatim can actually lead to a different sort of vapidness, where all of the elements that made up that original work kind of just get lost in the translation sauce. You know, just kind of missing the forest for the trees. How many other ways can I put this? Like, sure, Rorschach has a cool look. His mask is cool, the trench coat is cool, but we're so focused on bringing the cool visuals to life and making it sexy that we just kind of forget or gloss over the fact that he's supposed to be this wretched, disgusting, sociopathic, violent, broken man who is quick to react and react with disgust to everything from actual pedophiles and cannibals to just the sight of women or queer people. Like, he obviously has deeply rooted problems that led him to being the stunted nightmare of a man that he is. A fundamentally broken person, like all of the characters in Watchmen. Something that Zack Snyder's movie is so allergic to addressing because it just wants to make everything look cool and look sexy. It's one of the main questions of the book. What kind of twisted people would actually be drawn to becoming a superhero who solves all their problems with violence and power? And I don't think that any of this is lost on a reader who is reading the graphic novel. You get to actually sit with and stew in the words that Rorschach writes in his journal. And because of the freedom of illustration, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons can play around with how Rorschach sees the world and views people around him. They literally have him read The New Frontiersman, which in universe is a right-wing newspaper that promotes reactionary thought and conspiracism. And with the way that the chapters are broken up in the graphic novel, Moore and Gibbons give us actual excerpts from The New Frontiersman, in-universe articles and side stories, giving us even more of a window into this insane world full of insane people who do insane shit for insane reasons. But in the movie, because of the type of movie it is, and the man who directed it, everything is just a little bit more objective in the way it's presented. Still stylized, but everything is presented more straightforwardly. And that just really clashes with the way that the original graphic novel told its story. While in the novel, you are more inclined to question the way that characters go about things and the ways that they think, in the movie, it's just presented as a straight action mystery with superheroes. Look, I could go on for hours about this, the way that the movie glamorizes the fuck out of Rorschach, or the way that it completely fumbles the whole Dan Night Owl dissatisfaction with normal life, and the hole left in him when after being forced to retire, and you know how the whole like impotence scene was kind of boiled down to a boner joke in the movie in a moment that totally was not presented in a funny way in the book, but you know, I digress. It's just crazy how an adaptation can be so faithful to its source material, but still fail to adapt the bits that matter. You know, the subtextual and metatextual things that, you know, you might not have noticed, but your brain did. But hey, we're here to talk about video games, right? So, I don't know, let's talk about The Last of Us. Let me pose a question to you. How interesting would it have been for the Billstown episode of The Last of Us show to just be 50 minutes of Joel, Ellie, and Bill killing infected to get from point A to B? Have a little dialogue, and then Joel reads a note or something that he found that tells the audience about something, or Bill and Frank's relationship. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty boring episode of TV. Like, be honest with me. Do you just want this? For 50 minutes so that Joel and Ellie can get that truck so that they can drive to Pittsburgh, and then have another episode that's just this. For another 50 minutes, and on for an entire season of television. An adaptation that seeks to retain some of the core elements of its source material, like, you know, broader concepts and themes, and maybe even explore ideas and themes that were present in the source material but weren't thoroughly developed because of the trappings of the original medium. Maybe the most famous example of something like this might be Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, an adaptation that narratively is still dealing with the same really broad strokes of the source material, but also acknowledges the differences between the two mediums and takes into consideration the language of the new medium to shape the story and concepts to create a version of the narrative that is more compelling as a film or as a television show or whatever it may be. Then there's narrative-focused adaptations, probably the most common kind of adaptation, and probably the first thing that you think of whenever you hear the word adaptation. Just the straightforward retelling of the same story as the source material, usually with some very, very, very minor changes, like Denis Villeneuve's Doom movies kind of streamlining and truncating the timeline of events to better suit the pacing of a film, or the aforementioned Watchmen, with its change to the final step in Ozymandias' plan to kind of better ground it in the film's reality as opposed to the sort of satirical jab at Silver Age comics that the graphic novel's ending was going for. One of the few good things that that movie does as an adaptation, honestly. With things that fall under this category, it's pretty easy to call them an adaptation because you can look at the source material and the new material, the two compositions, and see the same characters doing the same things, just kind of rewritten in a different way depending on the medium it's being adapted to. Even with adaptations that take their liberties, like The Shining or Blade Runner or Fight Club or freaking Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, almost any MCU movie or show, you can still put on your X-ray goggles and see the commonalities. But with something like Fallout, you can put on your X-ray Walton Goggins goggle glasses. So what commonalities do you see? Well, it's very much in the same retro future Americana post-apocalypse frontier that the games are set in. There's vaults. There's no Vault 13 or Vault 21. Definitely no Vault 101 or Vault 111 since those games take place on the East Coast. There's the Brotherhood of Steel. They're obviously, a chapter of the Brotherhood that we haven't seen in the games. They have power armor though, and they're still very much the same sort of technocratic, semi-fascist weirdos. There are ghouls. There's the old Colt, 10mm pistol from Fallout 1. That's cool. A few other weapons from the game show up, like the Fallout 4 assault rifle. So, okay, there's that. Let's look at some games for stuff that we can draw a line to. Let's start with the first game. Okay, like I said, there's no Vault 13, so none of that stuff. Shady Sands? Shady Sands kind of shows up. It's not really the same Shady Sands from Fallout 1 or 2 because this takes place decades after those games. There's no super mutants at all, so, okay, hold on, let's look at Fallout 2, okay? No Arroyo, no Gek, the Enclave is here, but, like, there's no oil rig, no Frank Horrigan, there's no Platinum Chip. I don't feel comfortable calling this show an adaptation.